Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. So from here we are discussing about the historic built environments, especially from the point of conservation architecture. So this particular lecture is basically gives you an introduction of basic terminology used in the conservation studies, and especially what are the various charters which we should consider, and the fundamental criteria of selection of heritage sites, what is heritage precincts, and this kind of, it's a very brief introduction to these conservation aspects of built heritage. So when we talk about conservation, the first thing which pops in our mind is what is heritage, and how one can define the heritage, and how one can classify it, and how one can recognize it. I mean, how one can even identify the heritage. This is so before going into the thorough examples, so I would to show you some kind of brief understanding of its basic definitions. In 1972, the General Conference of United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which we call UNESCO, what we commonly refer is UNESCO, and UNESCO has organized this kind of convention of 1972 as its 17th session, and it has delivered certain articles on basic definitions of what is a cultural and natural heritage. So in fact, for the purpose of that convention, this particular definitions have been given. For instance, monuments, which talks about architectural works and works of monumental sculpture and painting, elements or structures of an archaeological nature. Inscriptions, cave dwellings and combination of features which are of outstanding universal value from the point of view of history, art and science. So in fact, a good example which I can show from the Indian geography is the Sanchi Stupa, which the archaeologists have, under the excavation projects, they have recognized that this belongs to the Buddhist stupa, and which is about 2nd to 3rd century time. And so this shows the unique feature of that time, what a stupa of the Buddhist philosophies, and how the relics are being placed, and how the stupa is made, and how the whole precincts have got its own heritage value. So similarly, I would also refer with the kind of various charters which have fallen in place following this definitions, and like Burra Charter, the Nara document of authenticity, in the Venice Charter, the Washington Charter. So there are a couple of charters which we will discuss in the following lectures, and it talks about the cultural significance, including the natural and indigenous and historic places with their cultural values. For instance, we have Bhojpur in the same Madhya Pradesh. What you see is a kind of Nagara style architecture, including Bhojpur and the Ashapuri. So here, this is some of the trips which organized from the architectural conservation course and urban conservation course with our students to visit these places. And before that, my previous workplace of School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal, Professor Vishaka Kavetakar and Dr. Ajay Kare, so they all have organized some along with Professor Adam Hardy. So they organized a study of this kind of historic temple precincts. And you can see here that some of what, when we go to the temple or when we go to these kind of heritage sites, we only look at these monumental buildings, or the kind of giant, the Shivalinga. What you see inside is a very huge, you can see the human scale. If you're talking about a 6 feet height, so you can just say it's almost 3 times the height of the Shivalinga. And there are many myths which talk about, in the ancient epic Mahabharata, that Kunti have stayed here, and some people talk about Kunti have left Karna in the river Betwa. Many myths goes on around it. But what is interesting to see from the architectural perspective is, in the whole site, it's a huge site. Many people think it will just a rocky site, but as if you keep walking down, you will see some kind of marks of these chisel marks in the quarry. So you can see how you can unfinished blocks of rock blocks which people were training, and you can see the chisel marks on it. And not only, very interesting is the drawings on the rock. Once you can see, this is, if one can notice, so basically it talks about a plan, it talks about the whole site plan. See, if you one closely notice these pictures, so this is how the indigenous understanding of the making a layout of those times, and how their drawings are carved on the rock. So what it tells us of the time, at those times, how the representation, it adds value. It talks about the scale, how people have imagined. It talks about their artistic quality. It talks about much more information on the aesthetic and the architectural quality. And here again you can see how the plans of temple have been drawn, and the rock drawings. So again you can see that the kind of drawings which are made on the rock. So basically this is all, it's not just a building there which is talking about a value of it, it is the whole site. So now there are the many interpretations that start coming. Maybe some of the parts which are not covered in these heritage precincts, recently some of my students have started looking and doing their theses on these mounds, uncovered mounds, where you can see hundreds and hundreds of Shivlingas there. So which talks about the kind of training they manufacture. They do a trial and error process, and then they carry over this to along the way to the original site. So it's a school of thought. One can recognize it's not just a building, it's a school of thought what one can look at. And similarly, just 7 kilometers adjacent to it, where we talk about Ashapuri. So in the second composition, which it is talked about groups of buildings, it is not just a monumental building, groups of separate or connected buildings which, because of their architecture, their homogeneity on their place in the landscape, are of outstanding universal value from the point of view of history, art or science. So I bring back, if you are talking about Ashapuri as a huge 56 temples of Ashapuri temple site. Adam Hardy have worked on it. For instance, you can see when they actually looked into this site, in fact, what you see is a group of temples, a group of buildings which are not connected with one another, but they're a group of small temples, and still you can see some of the remains. So people believe some of the stories which talked about is this kind of huge earthquake which have demolished that whole compound. But when they started investigating, you can see the river, the water body, some of the pieces have actually fallen down, and they were actually, part of it have been submerged in the water. So in fact, in that case, some Adam Hardy and his team, what they did was they tied ropes like this, and they made into segments, and so they tried to mark as it is from which segment of this has been salvaged, and they noted down those particular borders, because here what you see is the water here, so that they try to make a kind of graph sheet using the ropes, and then they try to take these small pieces and then try to assemble it, or at least try to interpret how it was based on the evidences. What you can see is they're all numbered and coded here. So the moment you get some similar pieces of it and you get its own interpretation and how it has generated. So you can see in Ashapuri temple, they had in the same village, they also collected all these pieces and they put down in the museum. So the sites, when we talk about the sites, works of man or the combined works of nature and man, and areas including archaeological sites which are outstanding universal value from the historic, aesthetic, ethnological or anthropological point of view. For instance, what you see here is the rock painting of Bhimbetka. Bhimbetka, the whole region near the Abdullah Ganj area in the same MP, you see a group of caves, and in fact in that whole region have some kind of evidence of these ancient settlements, cave dwellers. So what you can see, these rock paintings which that time man has carved about it talks about many stories, how an ancient man lives, and how what you can see is a kind of elephant, a man on the elephant, right? So it talks about their gauging patterns, their hunting patterns, and the celebrations of the living, how they celebrate. So all these things, the unique characteristics you can't find very frequently as you get in any other, you can't get these rich evidences. So the whole site is considered as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And coming to the definitions, where the CPWD manual in an Indian context, how they define the heritage building. It means and includes any building of one or more premises or any part thereof and or structure and or artifact which requires conservation or preservation for historical and architectural and artisanary and or aesthetic and cultural and environmental and ecological purposes. So it talks about any kind of structure. It is not only a built structure, it could be a kind of artifact of a monument or a small element of it, and include such portion of land adjoining such building or part thereof as may be required for fencing or covering in any manner, preserving the historical and architectural. So here it's basically talks about you have the monumental building, or it is any kind of artifact or a structure. It could be small to big, but it might be unique by its characteristics, but then how that whole premises could be also fenced, to define its area. So in order to preserve and for its historic and architectural values. So in fact in Bhojpur, what I can just show you is here you can see how this kind of big temple was constructed and their interpretation of how the ramp was constructed in those times. So obviously all these interpretations are a kind of evidences which they talk. And then when we talk about criteria how to list a heritage building, so the same manual talks about 3 important key concepts, especially for a worth of listing as a heritage. Number 1, historic significance. Number 2, historic integrity. And number 3 is the historic context. What we call about historic significance, it is the importance of a property to the history, architecture, archaeology, engineering or culture of a community, region or nation. So it could be association with events or activities or patterns. In fact, certain rituals are carried out, as we talked in Bourdieu's aspect also. So certain places are remembered with these events, certain places are remembered with these kind of activities, celebrations, and association with important persons. Like in fact Corbusier have designed the capital complex of Chandigarh. Obviously it is also, when we talk about capital complex, we talk about a person who designed it. When we talk about any emperors or any historic person, a rural who actually have constructed particular, like we talk about Taj Mahal. When we talk about Taj Mahal, obviously that event is talked about a particular king or who have made such provisions or certain procedures have been conducted. And how it is so distinctive, physical characteristic, design, construction of form representing the work of a master. Today when we talk about St. Peter's, Rome, the Michelangelo's and the Sir Christopher Wren's work on making the dome, obviously we talk about those masterpieces and how their method of constructing that such a huge dome. And we also talk about potential to yield important information such as illustrating social and economic history, railway stations, town halls. Like in Kiruna example, we talked about the town hall, which is a very recent building, but it has some association with the Kiruna community. It is hardly 60-year-old building, but still the association is, and even some of the old markets, if you go to Istanbul, the spice market, spice bazaar, so which has a historical significance in it. Technological innovations such as dams or where the traditional knowledge systems have been applied. Like for example, if you go to Istanbul, the underwater cistern system, it is a heritage site because in those days it is one of its, the traditional wisdom, how they tried to procure water, and the whole site is now considered as a heritage site. And where we talk about distinctive town planning features like squares, streets, and like for example the Rajpath, Lutyens, Delhi. Again, we talk about historic integrity, where it talks about the authenticity, and that is where the Nara document of an authenticity is very much valid. Of prosperity, historic identity, evidenced by the survival of physical characteristics that existed during the property's historic period. So in the Kiruna church, where we talk about Gustav's work on this huge wooden shingles work and the scale of it, and how it has become a symbol and icon of that community. It basically talks about the significant aspects of his part because people shared some memories with it, and it also not only must a property resemble the historic appearance, but it must also retain the physical materials, design features and aspects of construction dating from the period when it attained significance. Why the Kiruna case, why we are moving this church out, so why people are so much concerned about that they should also take care of the visual aspect of it, the physical material aspect of it, and the aspects of construction, because so that it retains back its own original appearance. Now when we talk about historic context, it is the information about historic trends and properties grouped by an important theme in the history of a community, region or a nation during a particular period of time. And a knowledge of historic context enables listeners to understand a historic property as a product of its time. When we are talking about a colonial building, obviously we are talking about certain stories going ahead with a particular given time, and obviously when we talk about the Dansburg Fort in Tarangambadi or a Trank Bar, so obviously there are certain colonial attachments from 15th century to 14th century onwards. Now in the same documents we talk about how this particular definitions talks about the natural features. What is a natural heritage? Because here till now we are only talking about the buildings or the monuments or the spaces, but how about heritage, the natural heritage? Like for instance, you see the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is a coral reef, a huge coral reef body, which is also considered under the natural heritage. It consists of biological formations or groups, and which are outstanding universal value, right? So it's not just only the buildings which comes in the heritage, but it comes to the natural features. And how the geological and physiographical formations, like in Tirumala, we call it as Shila Toranam, which is a natural stone arch, which is unique of its kind because of various historic conditions with the geomorphological conditions. Even today, one can see the kind of stone arch which is still preserved, and has certain value to it. And similarly, you have in the Kakadu National Park in Australia, where these are all the whole natural sites. It has certain ecological eco-sensitivity into it. So how this whole site could be considered as a heritage with a heritage character, and this because it appeals with the natural beauty, and it appeals a superlateral degree of the natural beauty. And coming to the World Heritage, heritage, it is our legacy from the past. It is not just came out of a bloom, but it is coming as a legacy from the past. What we live with today and what we pass on to the future generation, because what we learn from the past and how we live it today and how we give it to tomorrow. And our cultural and natural heritage are both irreplaceable sources of life and inspiration. So UNESCO have laid kind of there's a kind of group sort of thing which talks about the World Heritage Foundation, and then they actually given a certain criteria for selection. In order to be included in the World Heritage List, sites must be outstanding universal value and meet at least 1 out of 10 selection criteria. So they have laid out some 10 selection criteria, and it has to follow 1 out of these 10. Number 1, we talk about to represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. Like today when we talk about Eiffel Tower, yes, it is a masterpiece of how it has projected a technological, I would say, a benchmark. So in that way, it gives that kind of evidence that yes, this is a real set benchmark, and then this is one of the creative genius. So now, to exhibit an important interchange of human values over a span of time or within a cultural area of the world on developments in architecture or technology, monumental arts, town planning, or landscape design. One good example of this is Chandigarh. When Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, have visioned for a modern city, that is where the Le Corbusier have planned with his whole human anatomy form, and then he located the Capitol complex at the head and the Sector 17 at the heart, and that's how he the whole program of the city. But now today, very recently, if you look at it, it has been recognized out of that time's conditions, how the Capitol complex and its monuments are listed under the heritage list. So in fact, this open hand monument, what you see in Chandigarh, is a symbol of peace. So the way they talk about is when we say about an open hand cannot touch weapons. So in that symbolizes the peace. So in that way, the kind of monotonous understanding what Le Corbusier have portrayed in this cultural Capitol complex is considered now in the heritage list. Similarly, there's both tangible and the intangible certain folk traditions which have started disappearing, and as well as maybe the last remains or the last evident aspects of it. So the intangible aspect, like for instance the Kyotos in the Japanese city of Kyoto, washoko, which is a traditional Japanese cuisine, has been added to UNESCO's intangible cultural heritage list. So even the food, the culinary heritage, even the dance, the music, of which bears certain testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared, so it is not just only the monumental. So how the intangible component also is very much relevant. To be an outstanding example of a type of a building, architectural or technological ensemble or landscape which is at significant stages in the human history. Today we talk about Taj Mahal, we talk about Eiffel Tower, and so all these actually sometimes certain gardens, maybe some of the French gardens, some of the Mughal gardens, which actually talks about the pattern, how man has envisaged their patterns and the sensitivity. So all these one This is also one of the criteria. And now we talk about the fifth criteria is to be an outstanding example of traditional human settlement, land use or sea use which is representative of culture or human interaction with the environment, especially when it has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. For example, the city of Yazd in Iran, it is considered as a kind of, it is in the heritage list. So what you see is completely an earthen architecture. The way it's, if you look at, it is located in the Iranian plateau, which is about 270 kilometers from Isfahan, close to spice and silk routes, even the Silk Route network, and what are the various associations coming, the stories within that Silk Route network also gives us certain understanding. And it gives a testimony to the use of limited resources for survival in the desert. Water is supplied to the city through a canal system developed to draw underground water. So basically, this is one of the indigenous understanding of how to procure water and how to have a distribution system. And even recently in Bidar, they have found the karjais in Bidar and in some other place, I think in Burhanpur. So these are all some of the indigenous testimonies. And the earthen architecture has escaped the modernization. So it has not been influenced by the kind of much of modernization, and has escaped the modern that destroyed many traditional earthen towns, retaining its traditional. So in that way, the Kannada system, the traditional houses, the bazaars, the hammams, the mosques, and the Zoroastrian temples, and the historic garden of Daulatabad, all these, they are all considered within that heritage context and the precincts. And to be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or with beliefs, with artistic, sometimes even the literary works of which can stand outstanding universal significance. Again, we talk about the superlative natural phenomenon of areas of exceptional national beauty, like the Great Coral Reef. That itself is a good example. And representing the major stages of Earth's history, including the record of life, significant and ongoing geological processes, I think, which we discussed in all these processes. And significant ongoing ecological and biological process in the evolution and development of terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, again the ecosystems which we talked about in Australia are good examples of this. The most important and significant natural habitats for in situ conservation of biological diversity, and those contain threatened species, because much of the species are threatened, and how we can protect that is always a concern. Now, when we talk about the charter, I would like to introduce this Burra Charter, which actually has been framed and revised and in 1999. This charter actually sets a standard of practice of those who provide advice and make decisions and undertake works to the places of cultural significance, including owners, managers, and custodians. So who protect this heritage? Who protects this? Who will be responsible for it? So these charters will give you a kind of control measures. And what this Burra Charter talks is about it provides a kind of guidance is the cultural significance, how to protect, and a policy, the conservation policy, and it talks about the procedures of undertaking certain studies and reports. And it also introduces the code on the ethics of coexistence in conserving significant places. So like, as I talk about the heritage precincts here in Bhojpur, you can see the whole heritage precincts, because this whole site is basically, it is coming within that boundary, so which has to be protected, and within that maybe a buffer zone has to be also will be under the control. Like when you talk about preservation, it means and includes maintain the fabric of a place in its existing state and retarding deterioration. For example, what you see in Colosseum, many of its ruins have been kept like that, because part of what you see in the movie of Gladiator so that whole remains have been preserved so that it tells a story about it to the next generations. And similarly, when we talk about the restoration, if you see the Khajuraho temple, and Khajuraho temple, we see it includes the returning and existing fabric of a place to a known earlier state by removing accretions or by reassembling existing components, introducing new materials. So this is a kind of restoration process. So we are going back to the known earlier state. So now we talk a few examples, like as I discussed in the previous classes about the forbidden city of Peking, and you can see on the Kobe historic buildings how they have been reconstructed. And from restoration we are coming to the reconstruction, which means includes returning a place as nearly as possible to known earlier state and distinguished by the introduction of materials, new or old, into the fabric. This shall not include either recreation or conjectural reconstruction. Like what you can see here is a few examples from the Illinois, how they have been and London and Moscow. So how these bomb railways buildings, they're all reconstructed again. And you can see from Halil Onurma architect's presentations from Taksim. So how he brought the examples of how there are certain buildings which have been reconstructed. Like you have Lepage, and you have in the Dresden how it has been reconstructed, and the Humboldt foam, the famous Humboldt foam in Almania. And so there's all the reconstructed images. And here also you can see the difference between what is reconstructed and what is in Bhojpur temple. So to create that difference is more important so that one can understand that what is reconstructed component of it. And out of this, I conclude with this lecture on now defining the conservation. Conservation means all the processes of looking after a place, such as to retain its historical and or architectural and or aesthetic or cultural significance, and includes maintenance, preservation, restoration, reconstruction, and adoption or a combination of more than one of these. So basically, why I have given you, to come to this slide, I have given you an overview of all the definitions. So it's basically the process of how we maintain these places, how we preserve these places, and how we reconstruct. So in the next class, we'll discuss on the charters and the principles. Thank you very much.